woman, alone in her old house, hears faint scratching sounds coming from inside the walls. She tells herself it's just a mouse, maybe a squirrel, but the terrifying truth is so much worse. These are the kinds of stories we find in the deepest corners of the internet, shared by people who swear they are 100% true. They blur that thin line between a creepy campfire tale and a headline you'd see on the morning news. Now, are they actually true? We can't verify them. There are no police reports or news articles to back them up. They're unverified anecdotes, but the people who posted them swear they lived through them, and that makes them all the more chilling. Here are 5 stories that real people swear are true. Story 1, The Man in the Wall. My son, Leo, and I had lived in our house for about 2 years. It was a nice 2-story rental at the end of a quiet street, the first place that really felt like our own after my divorce. It was our sanctuary, or so I thought. The noises started on a Tuesday. I was working from home while Leo was at school. It was a faint, on and off, scratching sound coming from inside my bedroom wall, right near the closet. My first thought, pests. It's an old house. Critters get in. I made a mental note to call an exterminator if it kept up. And then, between work and picking Leo up from soccer, I forgot all about it. But it did keep up. Over the next week, I'd hear it at the weirdest hours. Sometimes a frantic scratching would jolt me awake in the middle of the night. I'd lie there, heart pounding, listening. But the second I was fully awake, it would stop. I started to wonder if I was imagining things. During the day, I'd press my ear against the wall, but all I heard was silence. I mentioned it to my landlord, who was, of course, no help at all. He just told me to put out some mouse traps and said he'd look into it. The first time I got really creeped out was about 2 weeks later. I was coming home with Leo after dinner at my parents'. The moment I opened the front door, I smelled something strange. It was musty and sour, like old laundry mixed with something else. Something foul. I checked the trash and the sink, but couldn't find the source. Leo scrunched up his nose and asked, "What stinks?" I just shrugged, opened some windows, and figured the kitchen needed a deep clean. But that faint, nasty smell lingered for days. Around that same time, I started noticing food disappearing. Just little things. A few crackers from a brand new box. An apple from the fruit bowl. The last slice of pizza I'd been looking forward to. I chalked it up to mom brain, thinking I'd forgotten eating it or that Leo was grabbing snacks. It's always easier to find a simple explanation because the alternative is just too terrifying to even consider. The real terror kicked in on a Saturday night. Leo was at his first ever sleepover, and I had the house to myself. I curled up on the couch with a movie and a glass of wine, and just as I was getting into the film, I heard it. Not the faint scratching, but a solid thump from upstairs. It sounded like something heavy had been dropped. My blood ran cold. I muted the TV, and the silence of the house just pressed in on me. I held my breath, listening, but there was nothing. Just the hum of the fridge. I told myself it was the house settling, the wind, anything but what my gut was screaming it was. But I couldn't shake it. My hand was trembling as I grabbed the heavy iron poker from the fireplace and crept to the bottom of the stairs. "Hello," I called out, my voice barely a whisper. The only answer was the thumping of my own heart. I forced myself to go up, scanning the dark hallway. Leo's room, empty. The bathroom, empty. The only room left was mine. The door was closed, just how I'd left it. I took a deep breath, gripped the poker, and pushed the door open. Everything looked normal. The bed was made, the windows were locked, but that smell, it was so much stronger in here, and it was coming from the closet. The same closet where the scratching had started. It was a deep closet, and at the very back was a small access panel to a crawl space that ran behind the wall. My brain was at war with my instincts. It has to be a dead animal, I told myself. A raccoon got in there and died. That's the smell. That's the noise. But the thump had sounded too heavy for that. I had to know. I dragged a chair over, my hands slick with sweat, and pulled the light chain. The dim bulb flickered on. Coats, boxes, nothing seemed out of place, except for a greasy dark smudge on the wall, right next to the crawlspace panel. I unlatched the little panel, and it swung open with a creak. A wave of that sour, foul air hit me so hard it made my eyes water. I leaned in, using my phone as a flashlight, and that's when I saw him. He was crouched in the dark of the crawlspace, not 5 feet away from me. He was thin, his skin was pale and filthy, his hair was long and matted, and his eyes were wide and locked right on me. He was wearing an old set of my ex-husband's work clothes that I'd stored in that closet. And he was smiling. It wasn't a normal smile. It was a wide, lipless grin that stretched his face into a grotesque mask. I couldn't even scream. The sound was just trapped in my throat. For a second, we just stared at each other. My mind couldn't make sense of it. This thing had been living in my walls, listening to me sleep, stealing my food. He had been just feet away from me and my son for weeks. Then the spell broke. I stumbled backward, fell off the chair, and crashed to the floor. The man didn't move. He just kept staring with that horrible, fixed grin. I scrambled out of the room, my eyes locked on the dark opening in the closet. I slammed my bedroom door, locked it, and then I ran. I didn't grab my purse or keys. I just flew out the front door and into my car, fumbling with the ignition. I drove to a 24-hour gas station and called 911, my voice shaking so badly the operator could barely understand me. The police came and went into the house. They told me later he was gone, that he must have slipped out the back, but they found his nest. In the crawl space, there were empty food wrappers, water bottles he'd been refilling from the bathroom sink, and a little pile of my things. A scarf, a photo of me and Leo from my nightstand, and the worst part, what they found tucked just inside the closet. A large kitchen knife, taken from the butcher block in my kitchen. He hadn't just been living there, he had been watching and waiting. We never went back to that house. The police never found him. Sometimes at night, I'll hear a floorboard creak, and my heart will just stop, and I'll see those wide, dark eyes, and that terrible, terrible smile. I still check the locks 3 times, and I never leave a closet door open. There's a special kind of terror that comes with someone invading your home. But what if the danger isn't a total stranger? What if it's someone you willingly let into your life? Someone you thought you could trust? Our next story is a chilling reminder that the worst monsters are often the ones we invite inside. Story 2, The Roommate Over the Crib. A Redditor named David shared this story about a judgment call he and his wife, Sarah, will probably regret forever. They were young, with a newborn baby girl, Mia, and money was tight, they decided to rent out their spare room. After a few interviews, they settled on a woman named Jessica. She was quiet, a little awkward, but seemed harmless enough. She worked nights and mostly kept to herself. For the first month, it was perfect. The first red flag was subtle. David came home one afternoon and found Jessica just standing in the living room, staring at baby Mia sleeping in her bassinet. He said the intensity in her gaze made the hair on his arms stand up. She wasn't cooing or smiling. She was just watching. The moment she saw David, she jumped and scurried back to her room, mumbling something about how cute Mia was. They brushed it off. She's just awkward, they thought. A few weeks later, a neighbor named Mark knocked on their door, looking agitated. He asked David if they knew Jessica well. David said, "Not really." Mark then told him that his wife had woken up in the middle of the night to find Jessica standing over their own infant son's crib. She had apparently let herself into their apartment. When Mark's wife screamed, Jessica bolted. David and Sarah were horrified and immediately confronted Jessica. She denied everything, becoming hysterical, crying, and claiming the neighbors were lying. For a split second, her reaction was so dramatic they almost believed her. But the look in her eyes was cold. They told her she had 2 weeks to get out. Those were the most unnerving 2 weeks of their lives. Jessica stayed locked in her room. The air in the apartment was thick with resentment and dread. David and Sarah started locking their bedroom door and moved Mia's bassinet right next to their bed. They felt like prisoners in their own home. On the day Jessica was supposed to be gone, David came home to find her things still there, but she was nowhere to be found. Furious, he started packing her stuff into boxes himself. When Sarah got home, they finished the job, threw her life into cardboard boxes, and felt a huge wave of relief. They changed the locks that night, finally able to breathe again. They put Mia to bed in her own nursery for the first time in weeks, with the baby monitor on their nightstand. They were so exhausted from the stress, they fell asleep almost instantly. Around 3 a.m., David was jolted awake by a sound from the baby monitor. It wasn't Mia crying. It was a soft, rhythmic creaking. The floorboards in the nursery, his heart started hammering. He grabbed the monitor and turned up the volume. Over the static, he could hear it clearly, the creaking floor, and then a low, whispery voice. It was Jessica, singing a lullaby. He flew out of bed and ran to the nursery with Sarah right behind him. He threw open the door, expecting the absolute worst, but the room was empty. Mia was sleeping soundly. The window was locked. They searched the entire apartment, top to bottom. Nothing. Jessica was gone. The next morning, David was telling the neighbor, Mark, what had happened. As he described the voice on the monitor, Mark's face went pale. He pulled out his phone and showed David a post from a local communities watch group. It was a grainy security camera image of Jessica, climbing out of a ground floor window in another building. The post was a warning from a young father. He wrote that his wife had woken up to find Jessica standing over their baby's crib, and in her hand, glinting in the dim light, was a knife. The father had tackled her and held her until the police arrived. The apartment she broke into was directly below David and Sarah's. It all clicked. Jessica hadn't been in their nursery. Their cheap baby monitor had picked up the signal from their neighbor's monitor downstairs. She hadn't been singing to Mia. She had been singing to the neighbor's baby while holding a knife. They had evicted her for breaking into a neighbor's apartment, only for her to do it again, this time prepared to do something unspeakable. David said he and Sarah just held Mia and cried, saved only by a random quirk of radio frequencies. That last story is a nightmare about misplaced trust. But sometimes there's no trust to misplace. Sometimes the horror comes from a complete stranger with a motive you can't even begin to guess. All it takes is one single, bizarre act to shatter your sense of safety forever. Story 3: The Rope on the Door. This account comes from a woman looking back on something that happened when she was 15. There's no conclusion to this story, no arrest, no satisfying explanation. It's just a single moment of pure terror that's been burned into her memory for decades. She lived in a rural area, in a house set way back from a quiet country road. The kind of place where nobody locked their doors. It was a Tuesday afternoon in the fall. She got home from school before her parents, which was a normal. She let herself in, dropped her backpack, and grabbed a soda. She went to the living room at the front of the house, which had a big picture window looking out onto their long driveway. She flopped on the couch and turned on the TV. About an hour later, she was half dozing when some movement outside the window caught her eye. A man was walking up their driveway. She didn't recognize him. He was tall and skinny, wearing a dirty flannel shirt. He walked with a slow, deliberate purpose that immediately put her on edge. She sat up straight, her heart starting to race. This was before everyone had cell phones. The only phone was on the kitchen wall. The man didn't knock. He walked right onto the porch, his eyes fixed on the doorknob. Through the window, she watched as he reached into his pocket and pulled out a length of thick rope. Time seemed to slow down. Frozen, she watched him calmly loop the rope around the outside handle of the front door. He then stretched it across the porch to a wooden support pillar and began to wrap it over and over, tying the door shut from the outside. He wasn't rushing. He worked with a quiet, focused efficiency that was utterly chilling. Her mind was screaming. Why would someone do this? What did he want? She was trapped. He was sealing her inside her own home. The TV was still on, a laugh track playing over the scene of horror unfolding just outside. The man finished, gave the rope a hard tug to test it, and seemed satisfied. Then he did something she would never, ever forget. He turned his head slowly and looked directly at the picture window. Directly at her. His expression was completely blank. No smile, no scowl, just nothing. It was the most terrifying look she had ever seen, the look of someone who didn't see her as a person at all. He held her gaze for a long moment, then turned and walked calmly back down the driveway and disappeared. She stayed frozen on the couch for what felt like an hour, just staring at the rope stretched tightly across her front door. Was he gone, or was he hiding in the woods, watching, waiting for God knows what? Finally, she slid off the couch and crawled to the kitchen, staying low below the windows. She dialed her mom's work number, her fingers fumbling. When her mom answered, all she could do was sob. She finally managed to explain what happened. Her mom told her to hide, stay on the line, and that they were coming home right now. She crawled into the pantry and sat in the dark, clutching the phone. It was the longest 30 minutes of her life. Then she heard her father's truck tear up the driveway, followed by his furious shout when he saw the rope. He had to use a knife from his toolbox to saw through it. The police came, took a report, and searched the area, but they never found the man. No suspects, no leads, no motive, just a random act of psychological terror. The woman says that, even now, she can see that man's blank face staring at her through the window. She never found out why he did it, and in some ways, that's the most terrifying part. It wasn't about robbery. It was about power and taking away her safety with nothing more than a piece of rope and a look. Being trapped is one thing. But what happens when the horror isn't trying to get in because it's already loose, when the chaos isn't at your door but all around you? Turning your quiet neighborhood into a hunting ground. Our next story comes from a community that learned this firsthand. Story 4, The Screams in the Night. This story comes from a Redditor named Ryan, who lived in what he called a painfully average suburban neighborhood. But one night, that all changed. A little after midnight, Ryan was woken up by a scream. Not kids playing, not a yelp of surprise. This was a raw, blood-curdling scream that just went on and on. He sat bolt upright in bed and went to his window. At first, he couldn't see anything. Then the screaming started again, closer this time, moving through the backyards. Dogs all up and down the street started barking frantically. Then he saw the flashing lights. 1, 2, then 3 police cars tore down the street and screeched to a halt a few houses down. Doors slammed. Officers were shouting. The screaming had stopped, replaced by a silence that was almost worse. Soon, half the neighborhood was on their porches or peering through windows, trying to figure out what was going on. The story trickled out in hushed whispers between neighbors in pajamas. A patient had escaped from a nearby high-security psychiatric facility, a facility no one even knew existed. He was described as highly unstable and dangerous, and he'd been running through their neighborhood, through their backyards, screaming at the top of his lungs. The police set up a perimeter, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. A helicopter circled overhead, its spotlight sweeping across the houses. The entire neighborhood was on lockdown, transformed from a sleepy suburb into a hunting ground. Ryan said it felt surreal. The very places where their kids played were now being scoured for an unknown terror. After about 2 hours, the helicopter left and most of the police cars drove off. A rumor spread that the man had been caught several blocks away. Everyone breathed a collective sigh of relief. But the story wasn't over. The next day, the neighborhood was buzzing. But one of Ryan's neighbors had a piece of the story that was far more disturbing. Her house was right next to the one where the police had focused their search. She said the house had recently been sold, but was still empty. During their search, police had found a side door pried open. Inside, in one of the empty rooms, they found a steel table. She described it as looking like something from a morgue. There was nothing else in the house, just a single, cold, steel table. This detail sent a fresh wave of fear through the community. The screaming man was one thing, a random, chaotic event, but an empty house with a forced entry and a morgue table that was something else. It was premeditated, sinister. Was the escaped patient drawn to that house for a reason, or was this a second, separate horror that had been hiding in plain sight all along? The police never released any more information. The new owners eventually moved in, and life went back to normal. But the neighborhood was never really the same. People installed security cameras and better locks. For Ryan, the most chilling part was never the screaming. It was the image of that steel table in a place it did not belong, waiting in an empty house in the middle of their quiet, safe neighborhood, a silent testament to the fact that you never truly know what's happening behind your neighbor's closed doors. We've talked about malice and madness and the terrifying intrusion of the unknown. But this final story, this one is different. It starts with an invasion of privacy so complete it's hard to fathom, but it ends in a way no one could ever predict, leaving you to question the very nature of fear itself. Story 5: The Woman in the Attic. This story is about a woman named Maran, in her late 50s, who lived alone in the large old house she had inherited. She enjoyed her solitude, and the house was her castle. But like all old houses, it had its quirks. And as she would soon discover, her attic had a secret. It began with little things she could easily explain away. A cereal box that seemed to empty too fast. The thermostat being a few degrees warmer than she'd set it. The TV remote not being where she was sure she'd left it. She joked with her sister about having a house ghost who liked snacks and TV. Then came the noises, faint scuffles and bumps from the ceiling above her bedroom at night. She was sure it was raccoons in the attic. She kept meaning to call pest control, but she was busy, and the sounds were rare. The idea that it could be anything else was so impossible. It never even crossed her mind. The discovery happened on a rainy Thursday. She went up to the attic to find an old photo album. She pulled down the folding stairs, flicked on the single bare bulb, and climbed up. The attic was cluttered with a lifetime of memories. As she made her way across the dusty floor, she noticed something strange. Behind a stack of boxes was a small pile of trash empty chip bags, water bottles, candy wrappers. She stared at it, confused. She hadn't been up here in over a year. How? As she got closer, her confusion turned to a cold, sickening dread. Tucked in the corner was a makeshift bed made of old blankets and pillows. Next to it was a battery-powered radio with headphones and a portable electric hot plate, plugged into an extension cord that snaked its way down a small ventilation shaft. Someone was living in her attic. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. This person had been right above her head this whole time, listening to her every move, waiting for her to sleep or leave the house. The missing food, the changed thermostat, the noises. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't squirrels. She scrambled down the stairs, her mind racing, about to call the police. But then she glanced out her kitchen window and saw him. A thin, disheveled man was climbing the large oak tree in her backyard, its branches reaching a small attic window. He moved with a practiced ease that told her this wasn't his first time. This was his routine. He'd wait for her to leave, come downstairs to eat her food and use her home, then retreat to the attic before she returned. Frozen in shock, she watched this stranger slip back into her house as if he belonged there. The police arrived minutes later and arrested him in the attic without a fight. He was a homeless man who admitted he'd been living there for over 2 months, learning her schedule so he knew when it was safe to come down. That should be the end of the story. But this is where it takes a bizarre turn. When Moran went to the station to give her statement, she saw the man. He looked small and pathetic, huddled in a chair, and she didn't feel anger. She felt pity. She learned his name was John, and that he'd lost his job, his family, and his home in a tragic spiral of bad luck. He had found her house and was just trying to survive. They found a knife on him, but he swore it was for protection on the streets, and he never would have hurt her. And Maran, in an act of what some would call astonishing compassion and others might call utter madness, believed him. She dropped the charges. Then she went to the shelter where he was staying and offered him a room a proper guest room in her house. She helped him get cleaned up, find a job, and get back on his feet. He lived in her house for 6 months before he saved enough to get his own apartment. Her family was horrified. They thought she'd lost her mind, but Moran insisted she saw a desperate human being, not a monster. And the story ends there, leaving you with a deeply unsettling question. Where is the line between victim and savior, and what would you have done? Would you have seen a threat to be dealt with, or a person to be saved? The fear in this story isn't just about the man in the attic. It's about the terrifying, unpredictable depths of human nature, both his and hers. Your home, your neighborhood, the people you know, it all feels safe. But as these stories show, that safety can be an illusion, torn away by a sound in the wall, a voice on a baby monitor, or a rope on your door. They're a reminder that the scariest monsters are real, and they walk among us sometimes closer than we could ever possibly imagine. Which of these stories is going to stick with you? Have you ever had a moment that shattered your sense of security? Drop a comment below and tell us. We read every single one. And if you want more stories that will make you double-check your locks, be sure to like this video and subscribe. Maybe share it with a friend who enjoys being terrified as much as you do. Stay safe out there, and always, always trust your gut.